The year was 1853, and Alabama's oppressive heat clung to the sprawling plantations like a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Rumors had begun circulating among the overseers, whispers that should have been dismissed as hysteria, but they refused to die. White babies were appearing in the slave cabins, infants whose pale skin and uncertain cries clashed violently with the dark, crowded quarters they were left in. At first, no one knew what to make of it. Some dismissed the findings as mistakes, others as trickery by slaves or northern agitators trying to destabilize the plantation system. Yet the facts could not be ignored. Over the course of months, more white infants were found, each discovery sending shockwaves through the small towns and plantations of Alabama. Their origin was mysterious, their parents unknown, and the circumstances surrounding their presence horrifying. Plantation owners whispered that these children were the product of desperate acts, born of violence, greed, or twisted desire, a secret no one wanted to speak aloud. For the enslaved people, the arrival of these babies was a cruel reminder of the grotesque power imbalance they endured. Every cabin seemed to hold a secret, every hushed conversation hinted at horrors buried in the past. Local authorities were called, but the law offered little solace, unwilling or unable to intervene effectively. The children were taken into temporary care, and yet the questions multiplied. Who placed these babies here? Why were they left in the homes of the enslaved rather than among their own? And how could such a grotesque pattern repeat month after month without explanation? As the overseers grew more anxious, a network of rumors emerged among the slaves themselves. Stories circulated of plantation owners fathering children with enslaved women, of hidden affairs and secret arrangements meant to secure inheritances or maintain power. Yet some tales hinted at something darker, ritualistic acts, whispered warnings, and a fear that these children were part of a system designed to terrorize and destabilize both the enslaved and free populations. One woman, Mary Lou, a seasoned elder among the enslaved, claimed she had seen the pattern before. She described encounters with women who had been taken in the dead of night, pregnant, only to return with nothing but their pain and silence. According to Mary Lou, the infants were not merely abandoned, they were deliberately placed in slave cabins to sow confusion, fear, and despair, a cruel form of psychological manipulation that tested the humanity of everyone involved. As winter approached, the pace of discoveries accelerated, and the story reached the ears of a northern journalist who had been investigating the treatment of slaves in the Deep South. She arrived under the guise of a teacher seeking work, but her real purpose was to document what the plantation owners hoped would remain hidden forever. She spoke to slaves quietly, recording their accounts, piecing together fragments of whispered truths that collectively painted a picture more horrific than anyone could have anticipated. The slaves recounted seeing infants brought in under the cover of darkness, often with no explanation, sometimes in baskets or crude cloth wrappings, and always left in cabins where the women had no means to care for them properly. The children were fragile, crying endlessly, and some did not survive. Those who did were shrouded in secrecy, moving between cabins, hidden from prying eyes, and yet leaving an indelible mark on those who witnessed them. Among the enslaved women, there was fear, sorrow, and fury, an emotional landscape wrought with the impossible task of caring for the innocent amidst the horrors of forced labor, abuse, and systemic cruelty. The northern journalist's records described an atmosphere of tension and dread, a plantation where every whispered rumor carried the weight of potential violence, and every shadow seemed to conceal secrets that no one dared to reveal openly. As the investigation deepened, more unsettling patterns emerged. Certain plantations repeatedly reported the appearance of white infants, suggesting coordination, or at least a deliberate chain of events. Some suggested a network of complicity among slaveholders, perhaps to ensure that these children would become a permanent mark of power, control, or even shame. Families of the enslaved women were aware of the danger, but speaking out could mean death, exile, or punishment far worse. These secrets were embedded in the very structures of the plantation. The cabins, the fields, and the night air carried a history of terror and control that was impossible to escape. Mary Lou became a key source. For the journalist, sharing her memories in hushed tones, the nights when cries were muffled, the infants placed deliberately in certain locations the way some overseers would turn a blind eye while others participated. Her testimony hinted at a deliberate system of psychological manipulation, a way to instill fear across generations, ensuring that no one could ever feel fully safe or secure, not the enslaved, not the free, not even the plantation owners themselves. The journalist's writings, smuggled north, painted a picture of horror and mystery, a South that was not only brutal in its overt violence but also in the insidious, hidden ways it manipulated innocence for power. And yet, among the fear and despair, a strange resilience emerged. The women who cared for these infants, even in secrecy, were remarkable in their ingenuity and bravery. They protected, nurtured, and sometimes secretly reunited the children with families or sympathetic allies. This quiet defiance was a testament to the humanity that persisted even under the darkest circumstances, a human flame refusing to be extinguished amidst a world of cruelty and moral corruption. As part one closes, the journalist realized that she was dealing with a story far bigger than a single plantation, a network of secrecy, horror, and resilience stretching across Alabama, and perhaps beyond. The babies themselves, the women who protected them, and the hidden actors orchestrating their placement were all pieces of a puzzle that defied comprehension, a story the South hoped would remain buried forever. And yet, like every suppressed truth, it found its way into the light, carried on whispers, letters, and the courage of those who refused to forget. The following weeks deepened the sense of dread that had settled over the plantations, a thick fog that clung to every corner of Alabama's vast fields and cramped slave quarters. The journalist Emily Carter, a young woman determined to expose the horrors hidden beneath Southern gentility, had begun documenting each case meticulously, aware that her very presence was dangerous. Whispers of her investigations had begun circulating among the overseers, and it was clear some were actively trying to obstruct her. She spoke to the enslaved women cautiously, gathering fragments of stories while evading prying eyes. The women spoke of children placed in cabins under cover of darkness, of pale infants who seemed almost spectral against the darker skin of the enslaved community. Some had been left in the homes of women who were already overburdened with domestic work and field labor. Others were hidden in barns, closets, and beneath floorboards. The overarching pattern suggested not random acts of negligence or cruelty, but a deliberate orchestration. Someone, somewhere, was controlling the flow of these infants with calculated intent. One woman, Eliza, trembling as she spoke, recounted the night she found a newborn swaddled in faded linen at the foot of her bed, eyes wide, tiny fists clenching and unclenching. The child's cries were muffled by a nearby thick quilt, but the terror in the room was palpable. Eliza had recognized immediately that this was not her child, nor any child she had seen born on the plantation. She later discovered that others in nearby cabins had also received infants, all of them pale and fragile, and all bearing the faint scent of unfamiliar herbs, perhaps intended to calm them or mask some other nefarious purpose. Emily pieced together a disturbing theory that these children were being used as pawns in a twisted game of power, manipulation, and terror designed to destabilize and control both the enslaved and those overseeing them. As she dug deeper, she uncovered documents hinting at clandestine meetings among certain plantation owners and their allies in local government, all focused on maintaining social dominance through unthinkable means. There were letters detailing placements of infants, coded instructions about which cabins should receive them, and warnings to ensure that no word reached outsiders. The systematic nature of the acts chilled Emily to her core. It was not merely cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a strategic, darkly bureaucratic form of oppression calculated to terrorize, confuse, and dominate. Among the enslaved women, fear and rage intermingled with protective instincts. They shared strategies for concealing infants from prying eyes, for caring for them without detection, and for quietly documenting their existence in case the children were ever threatened. Often in poor health, sometimes dying in obscurity with no effort made to claim or care for them. The enslaved women, despite their oppression, demonstrated remarkable courage and ingenuity. Another described a woman who faked the death of a baby in the eyes of her overseer while secretly nurturing it in a hidden compartment beneath her floorboards. These acts of quiet defiance, however, could not erase the trauma experienced by all involved, the psychological weight of caring for a child not their own in a climate of constant danger and suspicion left deep scars. Emily documented not only the facts of the case but also the emotional toll, capturing the fear, despair, and rare moments of hope that defined the lives of these women. As winter loomed closer, the tension escalated. More infants appeared, seemingly without pattern or reason, and the stakes for the women caring for them increased exponentially. Emily herself became a target. Her presence on the plantations was noted by suspicious overseers, and she narrowly avoided being discovered on multiple occasions. One night, she overheard a meeting of plantation owners and local authorities discussing the infants, using language that was chillingly clinical, as if they were discussing livestock rather than human life. Phrases like allocation of wards, placement security, and monitoring compliance betrayed the systematic nature of the horror. Emily's writing captured not just the events, but the psychological warfare at play, the constant threat, the subtle manipulations, the ways in which power was wielded over both the enslaved and those who might attempt to intervene. As Emily Carter's investigation progressed into the bitter cold of December, the story of the hidden infants became increasingly labyrinthine, twisting into patterns she could neither fully anticipate nor comprehend. She had begun corresponding in secret with sympathetic members of the local community, people who had long suspected the grotesque reality but had remained silent out of fear for their own lives. One elderly midwife, trembling as she recounted events from decades past, provided details so horrifying that Emily's hand shook as she wrote them down. The infants were not merely hidden. They were rotated between cabins according to meticulous schedules, as if some unseen authority sought to erase the connection between child and caregiver, to sow confusion, anxiety, and fear among both the enslaved and those attempting to protect them. Emily discovered that some of these infants bore subtle marks, small scars, or traces of unusual herbs applied at birth, indicating that their health and growth were deliberately manipulated. Some survived through sheer willpower and the clandestine care of enslaved women, while others perished quietly, their deaths recorded only in secret notes or whispered recollections. These small tragedies accumulated into a haunting mosaic of human suffering, each piece connected to an invisible web of control. Late one night, Emily uncovered a letter hidden beneath the floorboards of one cabin, written in a spidery hand. It detailed instructions for the placement and observation of an infant named Sarah, describing not only the practical steps for moving her safely but also the expected emotional strain on her caretakers. The language was clinical, almost detached, as if the author believed that fear and love were merely tools to be wielded for compliance. Emily realized that what she was witnessing was not simply a series of cruel incidents, but a carefully engineered psychological experiment carried out across generations. She cataloged these letters, noting recurring names, dates, and instructions, slowly piecing together a timeline that revealed the systematic nature of the operation. Each document, each testimony, painted a picture of a society willing to sacrifice innocence in pursuit of control and domination. As the days passed, Emily felt the weight of history pressing upon her. The story of the infants was no longer abstract. No longer a matter of curiosity, it was alive, pulsing through the lives of those who had been both victimized and complicit. And then came the first direct threat. One evening, as she walked the narrow paths between cabins, she noticed shadows moving unnaturally through the moonlit snow. The sense of being watched, once subtle now, pressed against her like cold steel. Her notes were stolen from her lodgings, shredded carefully, leaving only a single warning written in charcoal across the wall: "Stop before you unravel what should remain hidden." Fear settled like a physical weight, but Emily's resolve hardened. She realized that exposing the full scope of the truth would not only illuminate decades of cruelty but also risk her own life. Still, she pressed on. Following leads, she uncovered evidence of complicity at every level. the local clergy who performed baptisms in secrecy to document the infant's existence without raising alarm, overseers who relayed information to one another under the guise of routine reports, and even members of the judiciary who quietly ensured that no legal interference disrupted the system. Emily's documentation captured these chilling networks, revealing a society built on both outward appearances of civility and underlying, meticulously organized cruelty. In the most harrowing accounts, she learned of instances where enslaved women were punished for attempting to care too lovingly for infants not their own. One testimony described a mother of 5 being beaten after sheltering an infant through a snowstorm, the overseer claiming that her attachment threatened the experiment. Yet even in these moments of despair, human resilience shone through. Emily recorded stories of ingenious deception, women substituting one infant for another to prevent harm, feigning ignorance when authorities inquired, and finding creative ways to nurture and protect life despite the omnipresent threat of punishment. It became increasingly clear that the system's architects underestimated the cunning, strength, and moral courage of the oppressed. As Emily's investigation reached its climax, she pieced together the horrifying rationale behind the operation. The infants, particularly those with lighter skin, were intended to sow fear and confusion, reinforcing social hierarchies while simultaneously exerting psychological control over enslaved populations. The ritualized movements, rotations, and secret placements ensured that no attachment could form, that no family could be stable, and that every woman's efforts to protect life were under constant surveillance. It was social engineering executed with merciless precision. One night, Emily visited a remote cabin where a young mother, barely 16, cradled an infant who had been swapped 3 times in as many weeks. The girl's eyes were hollow, exhausted, yet fierce with defiance. She whispered to Emily about the last swap, revealing the identities of those orchestrating the rotations, the coded methods used to conceal their involvement, and the exact timelines followed to maintain secrecy. Emily transcribed every word, aware that this testimony might never be corroborated but refusing to let it be lost. The emotional toll on her sources was immense. Several broke down mid-interview, tears mingling with laughter and whispers of disbelief that anyone had survived such calculated horror. Emily herself experienced recurring nightmares, visions of infants lost to the cold, women collapsing under impossible weight, and the cruel smiles of those who orchestrated the system. And yet, amidst the darkness, there were moments of profound courage and quiet triumph. Small victories: infants reunited with their mothers, letters hidden safely from prying eyes, women quietly asserting autonomy despite constant surveillance served as fragile lifelines, proof that humanity could endure even in the face of systematic atrocity. By the end of Part 3, Emily had compiled enough evidence to tell the world a story that had been buried for over a century: the deliberate, orchestrated manipulation of white infants on Alabama plantations as a means of terror control and psychological warfare. Her notes captured the terror, resilience, and extraordinary courage of those who had survived, offering a haunting glimpse into a society whose facade of gentility concealed unimaginable darkness. And yet, despite the meticulous documentation, Emily knew that the full scale of the horror might never be grasped by outsiders, that some truths were so immense, so profoundly twisted, that even her careful record could only hint at the enormity of human cruelty and the equally immense courage of those who defied it. By the time Emily reached the final stretch of her investigation, the reality she had uncovered seemed almost too immense to process. The plantations she had visited, the whispered testimonies, the hidden notes and letters all pointed to a system designed not only to exploit but to erase humanity itself. The infants, stolen, swapped, and hidden, had become instruments in a carefully constructed nightmare, one that had lasted decades yet remained largely invisible to the outside world. Emily traced the paths the infants had been forced along, through hidden crawl spaces, attics, and unmarked burial grounds, where even the faintest trace of life was meticulously erased. She discovered records, some etched into the wooden beams of forgotten cabins, some hidden in the margins of old account books, that revealed the systematic methods used to monitor and manipulate both the children and their caretakers. Each detail she uncovered deepened the horror. Particular times of year were chosen for swaps, certain weather conditions ensured secrecy, and the movements were timed so that no woman could predict where her child might be or when she might see them again. Emily came across one chilling account from a woman named Lillian, whose narrative had survived in the margins of a ledger. Lillian described how her infant had been taken while she slept, replaced by another child, who was nearly indistinguishable, and how she had spent days caring for the wrong infant, unaware of the switch. She spoke of the crushing guilt, the fear, and the helpless rage at being complicit in a system she had no power to resist. And yet Lillian had resisted in small ways, marking the children with tiny symbols, leaving them hidden notes of comfort, and secretly documenting the names and faces of each child, a quiet rebellion against the machinery of control. Emily marveled at the ingenuity and courage of these women, whose acts of defiance, though small, had preserved fragments of life, identity, and memory in the midst of orchestrated terror. But the further Emily dug, the more she realized that the horror extended beyond mere cruelty. Some infants, Emily discovered, had been subjected to deliberate medical experiments under the guise of care tests that measured endurance, resilience, and response to stress, all without consent or compassion. Herbs, concoctions, and treatments were administered not for health but for observation, creating a landscape of suffering that blurred the lines between punishment, research, and control. She read of infants left in freezing temperatures to test survival instincts, fed minimal rations to measure their resilience, and even subjected to sensory deprivation to study the effects of isolation. Each account, each carefully preserved note, revealed the magnitude of the cruelty inflicted and the chilling level of detachment among those orchestrating it. Yet within this darkness, Emily also uncovered moments of intense, stubborn humanity. She read about women who risked their lives to smuggle infants to safety, burying them in hidden compartments or taking them on long, treacherous journeys to neighboring towns. One particularly harrowing account detailed a group of women who orchestrated an escape during a violent winter storm, moving several infants across frozen rivers while avoiding patrols and overseers. The effort cost lives, yet some survived, testimonies that Emily documented with trembling hands, aware of their significance and fragility. As the narrative unfolded, Emily began connecting the psychological impact on the enslaved women with the wider legacy of trauma, noting how these events had created intergenerational scars. Mothers who survived carried the burden of knowing that other children had perished or been manipulated in ways that defied understanding. Their resilience, though heroic, came with lasting consequences, affecting mental health, family cohesion, and the ability to trust. Emily felt the weight of these revelations pressing on her own conscience, the enormity of the task before her bringing these stories to light becoming increasingly clear. And then, in a final, almost surreal discovery, she found evidence that the orchestrators themselves had faced consequences, though of a twisted, moral kind rather than legal punishment. Diaries of overseers and plantation owners, carefully preserved, revealed fear, paranoia, and psychological unraveling as the women and children they sought to control resisted and survived. Their attempts at domination had sown seeds of unrest and guilt that haunted them until the end of their days, a poetic justice in its own dark way. Emily pieced together every fragment, the swaps, the hidden care, the experiments, the resilience, the deaths, the letters, the coded messages, and the whispers of rebellion. She documented each with painstaking attention, knowing that the truth could never be fully comprehended in a single lifetime, yet determined to present it faithfully. By the end of her work, Emily had created not only a historical record but a tribute to courage, defiance, and survival. The story she uncovered, the deliberate, horrifying manipulation of white infants on Alabama plantations, the unyielding resistance of women and caregivers, and the subtle yet profound consequences for those who sought to control life itself, stood as both a warning and a testament. As she prepared to release her findings, Emily felt the enormity of her responsibility. She understood that the horror was only part of the story. Equally important was the resilience, ingenuity, and bravery that had preserved life and dignity in the face of unimaginable oppression. The world had ignored these events for generations, but through her careful documentation, the truth would finally be told. The infants, the mothers, the hidden acts of defiance, all would emerge from the shadows, finally recognized for what they had endured and achieved. And Emily knew that while the past could never be changed, bringing these stories into the light offered a form of justice, silent perhaps but undeniable, a recognition of both suffering and triumph, and a record that future generations could study, remember, and honor. In the cold Alabama winter, with the last letters carefully archived, Emily felt a quiet resolve. The story of the lost infants was no longer hidden, no longer silenced. The echoes of fear, resilience, and courage would now travel beyond the plantations, ensuring that the world could never forget the darkness that had once prevailed, nor the strength of those who had survived it.